curve is an example of the MAP growth assessment. It's a normative assessment. The purpose of MAP is to compare results of students across the nation. It doesn't say you're proficient or not proficient. It says, how do you compare to every other student at that same grade level across the nation? So if you look at that graphic, when you see the 60th percentile on the bottom, the kids to the right are probable or likely to be proficient in AK star. Why does that matter? Because if it's set at the 60th percentile in the linking study, that means in a typical setting, when you look at a large population, you would expect 40% of students to be proficient on AK star. So right when they hit that 60th percentile, they might have a 50.1% probability of being proficient. As they get higher, they're more likely to be proficient. So this applies to large groups. This does not apply to an individual student or a classroom, right? So you could see great variation in this in a school or a classroom because it's a small group of kids. But when you compare 20,000 students, such as the Anchorage School District, what happens is that population tends to emulate or mirror that normed curve as the population gets bigger. Okay, so that's an important graphic to keep in mind as we work through this. So we're going to now look at AK Star's math proficiency for 8th grade. Remember, in a large data set, just keep in the back of your mind, what would be typical? 40% of kids being proficient in 8th grade math would be typical based on the statistics in the math. This is not like opinions. This is statistics and math. It's just literally a connection of those two assessments. So in ASD, this is the math results. And you can see the red box is 8th grade. We have 34.5% proficient and or above on the AK star. And remember, this is at the end of 2023 because of the late release of results. So that means we're about 5% right now below what is typical in the nation. Okay, the other grade levels are on there. I know that we've shared this with you previously in board docs. So you've seen this information. We're also going to, on the next page, just look at student groups to give that background. But again, from a goal setting perspective, we're really looking at the overall district in terms of our goal. So this is the student groups based on ethnicity. And I'll just give you a moment to take a peek at that. Again, we're not setting a goal to this, we're setting it to the overall. Go ahead.
Does that also exist for the SPED, ELL, economically disadvantaged sort of subgroups?
So in the vendor site, it does not, but we pull that out in our data. We didn't put it in this particular presentation because we're focused on the overall district goal. But we have that information internally. Yeah, but it's not shared through NWEA's site, which is the vendor that does AK Star.
I just want to note that member Wilson is joining us.
Okay, so next. So I want to show you a little bit of supplemental data. And this is looking at the 5 big school districts to kind of give context of where people are at. And remember, again, going back to that norm, we would expect about 40% to be proficient. So you can see the 5 districts here. And again, this is for 8th grade math. This is the 5 large school districts. And as you look at that, what I want to cue you into is you'll notice that all of them are either in the low to mid 30s to 41. They're kind of clustered around that 40th percentile. That's what we would expect because of the way this assessment is designed. Good with that? Yeah.
Do we have a sense of opt-out rates for Anchorage for the 2023 data? I mean, how many?
Yeah, we do have that. I didn't put it in here. I can't remember it off the top of my head. I'm happy to get that to you. I do have it.
I mean, we can only set a goal for the students who essentially take the test.
Yeah, of course. And the one thing that we don't have is we don't know, based on opt-outs, we don't know like exactly who those kids are and what demographics they represent. So it's a tricky metric. But again, we still have many thousands of kids taking it. And so remember, as the group grows larger, the more likely you are to emulate the national curve and norm.
What percentage do opt out?
You know, I think I can give you a ballpark and I have it and I can get back to you on Board Connect. But typically we probably have close to 20% opting out. In elementary, our rates of participation are much higher than they are in middle and high school. For some reason, there's a increased amount of opt-outs as the kids get older.
I think that would be helpful to understand, especially if the students who opt out are skewing towards students who are already showing proficiency.
It is, and
Because that adds some nuance to all of this.
it does. But again, the number of kids taking the assessment is still quite large.
Mhm.
And so that will incorporate, students that are performing all over that spectrum of the curve. Yep.
I'm curious about the test results in regards to demographics. Is there any evidence that because we know the academic achievement gap, is there any association with that with the test or any other reasons why that big achievement thing, or you think that's a valid statement of what's happening?
Can you restate that? I didn't quite.
In other
follow.
words, we have a larger, when we looked at the reading, we had 28% whites, not, below, but we had 66% blacks, 70% Alaska Natives, and 81% Hawaiian Pacific Islanders below. Is that in any way associated with the accuracy of the test results, or is that pretty accurate?
Well, I'm not sure when you say, is that accurate? I guess I'm not.
Is there any, is it a reflection of the academic success of different demographics group within the Anchorage School District of being so poor with different demographic groups, and we have a large academic achievement gap? We look at the group as a whole, how we're doing, but when we look at the demographics and you got the curve, you find out what's on the bottom and the top is entirely different, okay? Because of what percentages are there. So the concern that I have is that we have such a large demographic difference. If we're gonna raise our scores, we gotta do something with the bottom where people are not learning or not being successful. And it's often one of color, nationality, it's associated with that. Our results were the most diverse school system in the country, and we do an awful job, it seems to me, when it comes to academic achievement gap. And so I'm looking at the results and I'm just trying to understand, is there any question about the test results being valid or any other issues that are out there other than this is a pretty accurate reflection?
It's a great question. AK Star is new, and so we don't have a long history of this exam, but what we can say is that we have experienced disparity over many years in multiple assessments. Which is not unlike what we see nationally, but it's not an excuse because we need to do better. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of the assessment itself, we don't see the design of the assessment. It is developed by NWEA, which is a highly reputable organization. And so, we take those results as valid because that's the sort of benchmark that we're working from. And so I don't have access to the details of the design of
I
it.
just saw a presentation by the National School Board Association over a year ago in which they were studying the effectiveness of school boards. And in some school districts, blacks were number one as far as academic outcomes, another one, American Indians were number one. It was interesting, dramatically different from the country. And I'm curious about what anybody's doing differently and if there's some other justification that reason why we get such poor results.
I was just gonna counter, we're not talking about reading, but our kindergarten reading data just showed that our teachers and our system as a whole did a massive amount of catch-up growth. I think that is amazing. We started significantly behind the national average and we are nearly on par. So
I realize to catch up, but I'm just looking at this from a practical kind of standpoint. that if we're gonna be a high-performing school district, we can't leave behind when the majority population, there is no majority population.
I think it's a really valid question. One thing I would go back to is towards the last month or so, when we were looking at our MAP results and we were looking at catch-up growth of students who were starting the year struggling. The one really positive about that was there was very little disparity across ethnic groups in terms of the percentages of kids making 1.5 years of growth. And so there are some positives there, but in the end result, there's no doubt that there's disparity. Your point's well taken.
You know, I think one of the things that really resonates with me is the fact that, you know, our kids come to us with different needs. And while we're trying to address that systemically, it's gonna take time and it's gonna take resource. And, you know, I think every one of our kids have the ability to achieve if given the right supports and given the right situation. So we really can't, you know, so am I concerned, Member Higgins? Yes, I am with those, with where especially our kids of color are. But at the same time, the system has to change that's providing the services. I mean, I go back to the couple of, I think 2 years ago, we had a presentation from IU Pasata, and she used that symbol of a plant. If the plant is dying, you don't like ask the plant, why are you dying? You check the soil, you check you tend to that. You do it a different, you might give it some nutrients. So that's why we're here today. We're trying to figure out how to make every one of our amazing plants thrive. And it's not gonna happen overnight. I think the Alaska Star, I mean, that's what within the last 10 years, the third, I think, tool that the state has adopted. And so we've got to adjust to that, and our kids have to adjust to that. But I do believe, sincerely, our kids are much more than a test score. And so we've got to understand, at least I choose to focus on, you know, what are the environments that we are creating for our kids? How are we resourcing our schools? And make sure that we are, that we don't leave anybody behind. I'm not leaving anybody behind. But I have to believe that they are much more than a test score.
I would like to request them, something that goes back to look at academic growth by grade, by demographics. I know we have that kind of data. So if we can get a report of that, and then I want to go back 5 years and look at the academic growth of sixth grade across the board, because I know we're changing the way we're going to do that. Let's evaluate the success of that as well, of that middle school. You can see what we've done in the last 5 years with academic growth, and we can look at what happens at the end of the issue coming up.
We have a few, MAP is probably our most ubiquitous assessment, because they've changed, right? And to Member Bellamy's point is, as those assessments change, it makes that really tricky. And sometimes we don't have control over that with the state's prerogative in terms of the assessments we use, but for MAP, we could probably do that for you. So going back to this, that's the thing I want to cue you into again, is we're in that sort of mid to 30 range to 40. And that's rather expected when you look at MAP compared to AK Star. So now the next one is, here's this percentage at the end of 2023. And our goal is to set the goal for 2028 for the overall school district and 8th grade math. And so just to kind of frame that in your minds, next one. So I do want to take 3 or 4 minutes. This is some research that comes from Board on Track, National School Board, Wallace, Hanover, and a variety of school districts around the nation. And I'd like to take 3 minutes and just have everybody read this. These are some of the best practices in the research around goal setting. And then I just take a minute or two to kind of share out anything that stands out to you. So those four goals are just examples. Of course, we're focused on math for eighth grade. But it just is a framing, in terms of current research on school board goal setting. Is there anything that, stood out to you or you'd like to share? Is there a question? Just, was there anything that stood out to you from this sort of background knowledge and research on school board goal setting?
You know, setting realistic and achievable goals. I mean, it didn't stand out, but it actually, I mean, that's what we want to do. I know part of me wants to just be really, aspirational. But I think the reality, I'm trying to figure out how to be realistic and aspirational at the same time. And so instead of looking at growth, achievement we have to look at it in increments over years. I do think in the end, I think we really have to look at, figure out what we want all kids to know and be able to do within a span of time. And the other thing is the ongoing progress, concentrating on a limited number of goals. We can't do everything. And I do appreciate the fact that this board has been really focused on the 3 goals. So that kind of stands out for me in terms of, moving forward to set our targets.
I think, the relationship between aspiration and realism is critical. I think about the state's goal that every student will be proficient in 3rd grade reading under their current funding model and think that is untenable and not realistic. They're gonna have to change some things in order to attain that as a state. I think 2 things, I appreciate the digging down into the how you can think about realistic goals. But in particular, I'm thinking about our context. 8th graders in the class in the fall, in FY 28, they were 1st graders in FY 21. And we're going to be looking at 8th graders for the next few years, but we know that we're still, students are still deeply affected and in need of catch-up growth from lost learning opportunities. So I think that should be a factor in our realistic approach. And also when we think about, when we look to December and our pro forma budget and the FY 26 budget process, the most recent projection that I'm aware of from our CFO is in the best case scenario, if we receive every penny from the governor in a matter of weeks for FY 25, we're going to bring our FY 26 budget deficit down to $71 million. So that's the good news. We could spend our fund balance down to 5% and knock, some number of millions off of that. Again, this is getting in the weeds, but I'm seeing that we are going to prepare a FY 26 budget by increasing PTR substantially and doing other things. So how will this board frame our goals in light of a very realistic prospect of increased class sizes and the need for COVID catch-up growth? So I don't want to be a pessimist, but that glass is not half full. At least over the next year.
When I read this, I think back to 2010, 2009 school board, and we had low 60% graduation rates. The administration told us 1 to 2% we could achieve. That's realistic. The board said the heck with that, and we pushed a higher goal. And I think it was 6 years later, we were close to 80%. But we had people then really focus on doing the goal. When kids were walking out of school, they went after them to get them back. Dropout rates went from 6.5% to 3.5%. And many of the 3.5% kept coming back. If we set a high goal, we want something, it doesn't mean it can be achieved, it's just easier. This is safe goal. What I see here is a safe goal. Depends upon the circumstances here, what we can do. I'm kind of focused on what are we doing to achieve it, not just these numbers. I'm gonna tell you, when I got back on the board, we had two goals here. One was, diversity in hiring, another one was getting access to the different schools. Met with superintendent, they had done nothing, they said, we got 5 years to do it, they haven't done anything. So the four goals and the four gold rails is my biggest concern. That was done before I got on the board. Two of those board members didn't get reelected. Got four board members that have never been involved in the goals and guardrails. And so we're focusing in on strictly limiting to that, and we've got some serious issues. I agree with funding issue for schools underachieving, how we're dividing stuff, and you name it. So my concern about this is that's a goal. If we want to say this is required, and you want to say we have a goal higher, but this is what we expect, and we're gonna hold accountability, that's one thing. Instead, we set low goals, but if we don't meet it, we will close. And that's a concern to me. That's a concern because I've seen too much of not achieving the goals and explanations, and now I'm getting the concern that make sure you don't set the goals high.
Well, I appreciate that, and I was just listening to the numbers that you described. So approximately a 20% increase in graduation over 6 years is about a 3% annual goal. So it's important to remember these are annual goals. And so even though the 2028 goal might be much higher, it's that sort of projected incremental approach. So I appreciate that.
There was reference to the goals and the guardrails, and I was not on the board at the time that the discussion was happening, but I was part of the discussion on the community side. And I do feel that the goals and the guardrails reflect the community's values and vision. And I wholeheartedly support our goals as a board member, and prior to that as a parent. So I guess different point of view in that regard, because I was one of those board members that wasn't elected, but I had the honor of being able to vote on those goals and guardrails. So I think they're incredibly important, and focusing, as a foster parent, as a therapeutic foster parent, we have our own goals and objectives that we focus on with our kids. So I have that commonality in that regard, and we typically have 3 objectives, maybe 4, that we're working on with our youth, because like Margot said, to do more than that dilutes the opportunity to make progress with just that one kiddo, much less the diluting the opportunity to work on those goals with 43,000 kiddos. I mean, that's so that commonality for me sets in, because on a daily basis, I have to work on the 3 or 4 goals. I can't imagine teachers needing to work on more than that, honestly, and continue to make progress at the level that needs to be made with those goals. So I appreciate the conversation, and I agree with much of the conversation, that the realistic goals, to make them to continue to be aspirational, but also with the blend of reality, because I don't want to overburden our students with the expectation of, hey, this is where you should be, but this is where you're at. That's a lot of stress on our students, and it's harder to celebrate those milestones when you feel like when as a student or as a parent, I'm hearing, they should be in the 95th percentile, and they're in the whatever percentile we're sitting at. I would rather have the opportunity to achieve those goals and exceed those goals for our students and our teachers. That's a lot of stress to put on our teachers when you're not being realistic about the goals.
Member Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I think in 2020, when 4 new board members came on board, we went through an extensive full day of looking at the goals. You got to keep, delete, or modify any single goal to make them your own. So I'm surprised that, and again, these goals they came from the community and if we're gonna change change them, then I don't think that's why we're here today. So Mr. Chair, can you clarify why we're here today? I thought we were here to do the targets for the goals that we worked on in January. Not to debate the process by which we got to the goals. So I just need some clarity. Because I thought we were setting the targets, which is what this presentation is all about.
Well, I'll say this was sort of set when I came in, so I didn't set it up exactly. And we're,
And that's, and as the past president that said it, the intent was for us to come together to continue the work that now that we have. Remember, we couldn't set the targets. We worked on the goals at our retreat in January, which is what we have now. The only thing that was missing from the goals were the targets. We did not have the data from the state as expected in advance. We had a full discussion on growth. We have had that discussion. So today, the intent of us coming together around the data to set the targets, not to renegotiate the goals, but that's just me. If that's what the board wants to do, I think it's that was not the intent of this.
I'm gonna say when the floor gets open, it gets open, but first we're looking at map data. I think goals are always kind of tough, and I'll say this as a classroom teacher. When the board would set a higher goal, I always think that's nice. Are they giving me fewer students? Are they giving me access to some technology or programs? Are they? And to touch back on what Member Lessons pointed out, we're going to try to set a higher number. We want to advance. We all want to advance. And yet, with the exception of some things that come through the Alaska Reads program aimed at a target audience, we're making it tougher on everybody. I can't think of too many areas that we're enhancing because we don't have the resources to enhance. So yeah, I just think that teachers come in and try every day to move every student they've got as far as they can. And it's nice for the board to say, and we want you to move just a little bit further. But I will say that's always a conundrum that swirls through my mind when we're looking at this high level. We'd like for you to get a higher number somehow. And that just always tempers how I feel about it. So, Member Jacobson and Member Lawson.
Yeah, so I just want to say that I don't know that I've heard a significant discussion about changing goals so much as maybe philosophical visions for what the integers are in the formula. With that said, if circling back to the original question is, you know, what are takeaways from kind of the slide and the slide deck? I think it's an interesting question that I'm going to continue to keep in mind throughout the rest of the presentation. How we can incorporate the resources that were given as a district, which we know, at least from the state level, to be deficient. I think we should have an answer for that, for our community, for the legislature, for the Department of Education. That should be a factor that we can articulate that I don't know that I could clearly articulate now. So I think that's something I'm going to flag to make sure that we identify. And I appreciate Member Lessons bringing up the state goals, which are wonderful on paper, but reflect the fact that those folks aren't doing the work in classrooms.
I had a question, probably for Chris. We don't have results from AK Star from spring of 2024. We won't have that until the fall. But my sense is that we likely do have spring math
We do.
data. Do we know, do you have a glimmer of insight about how students did? Well, I mean, what can we take from map data? It's not, I mean, through the linking study. Do you have a sense of how eighth graders did this year relative to last year?
I could get that for you, member lessons. I don't want to share something off the top of my head and get
Okay.
it inaccurate. I didn't, off the top of my head, I didn't see significant changes.
Okay, so I think that's the question, sort of at the core, did we see enough of a change that would indicate, yeah, we did about maybe a 2% growth, or maybe a 3% growth, or maybe a 4%, or maybe it flatlined. And I feel like that seems like it could be helpful. Sort of a glimpse behind the curtain while we, await. I think it would, I realize the importance of studying. I think it's really important that we set these figures, because I see the goals as the primary means through which the superintendent will align available resources, right? And design curricular approaches and strategies. So the board's goals are critical. I come back to that first in the spring of 2021, when we joined the board, and I was really pretty unhappy that our math goal was set at 55%, and Dr. Bishop said that's because we don't have the money to set it higher. That case was made pretty clearly for me then. So our goals should reflect the available dollars that we have. We focused on an 80% reading goal at the time, because that was deemed really critical. We needed a higher reading goal than we needed a math goal. And she said, we don't have the money to do both at that high level. So I guess that was my learning moment. So our likely available resources and whatever progress we have made in the last year certainly would shape my realistic approach to board expectations for growth.
And for the record, member Donnelly has joined us in person. Member Higgins.
The recollection I have for Superintendent Nina Bishop is that she can't raise the math scores because, the reading scores go up because of the length, and that holds them back, which is a problem that used to be with everyday math, and she kind of referred to it the same way. That was real troublesome to me, in line with that, because they linked the two. If you can't read, you can't do math, and that was a real bother, because that has to do with curriculum and what we're doing. And so that's an issue. The reason why I raised this issue is we're looking at trying to raise the middle scores, okay, to get that increase. But I recall the top 20% for 2020, all the breakdown of how kids are doing. And the group that did the worst was the very top. 20% got 80% of the year's growth when they were in the very top of the group. They weren't growing very quickly. But the administration and putting resources done away with the Ignite program, which addressed the group that was doing the least growth. So it's kind of interesting. My concern with these scores, and you asked about feedback on it, and that's what I was giving you, is I'm only concerned about whether these scores are going to somehow adversely impact our focus on helping the lowest perform gain a year, even if they can't get to that 40%, or the kids at the top, letting them go back. Congress did a study with Head Start, said that they start off way ahead of kindergarten, and fourth grade, they're at the same level, because they're held back while they're with the class and then move up. So that's the differentiated instruction is a big issue to me. So that all kids are growing academically, not just targeting one score. And that's what my concern is with this. When I read the scores, I'm just concerned it's not addressing all kids. It's addressing a small section of it, and it's focused on that at the expense of other kids' academic growth. And that's a discussion when we set the goals. I don't know whether or not that's going to adversely impact the growth of other kids. And the academic achievement gap just gets ignored.
You're ready to continue.
Sure. Okay, well, great, thank you. So considering that background knowledge, we want to show you an example. And again, after this, we're going to be handing it back to President Holloman, and you can have a conversation around the 2028 goal. But thinking about a reasonable annual target, so remember this is an annual target. You'll notice 2023 all have the same starting point. On the left-hand side is an annual goal. And then in 2028, that's where the end percentage would come out. And then on the very far right, remember that looking at the statistics behind it, what is typical is about 40%. That's just the math behind it. It's not an opinion, it's the norm study.
What do you mean by typical?
So typical, meaning this is, we reviewed this, member Donnelly, it's in the map. We shared information about how the map linking study works with AK Star. And yeah, thank you, Leanne. So right here, if you'll notice in 8th grade math, when students hit the 60th percentile on math, so the top 40% of students, that's when statistically they become probable. In other words, slightly over 50% likelihood of being proficient on AK Star. And this is compared to national data. And so what that tells us is students, when they hit the 60th percentile, they become likely, slightly over a 50% chance of being proficient on AK Star. So in any given setting, when you're looking at a large population, not a classroom, not a kid, right? The macro level, we can typically expect about 40% of students in a large population to be proficient on AK Star based on that linking study. Is that great? And so when we look at these, what I want to draw your attention to then on the right, what you'll notice is it gives a percentage above typical. So if 40% is typical, just to kind of frame it, right? If you are 2 times that or 100% better, you would be at 80%, right? So with a 2% annual goal and a 2028 goal of approximately 45%, that would be about 11.25%, higher than what's typical nationally, right? 3% annual goal, getting you close to 50%, that would be close to 24% higher than what would be typical. And again, this is not opinions, this is just the statistics behind it. And so that, I just wanted to give that to you so that you had a frame of mind as you have this conversation. And then, and then you'll notice on the bottom, we just include that graph because that's where that norm study comes in and it links back to AK Star. And so this is the tough conversation that I'm going to hand back to you because of course it's the board goal. And so now, with that starting point, and we can go back to any slides that would be helpful, but President Holland, I would like to give it back to you because really the conversation now, having that background knowledge, is the 2028 goal for my 8th grade math.
Number one.
What are the top 3, 4 conditions in your mind to attain typical growth in the school system?
So this is me speaking personally. When I read research on improved outcomes, it's about a relentless focus on what happens in the classroom every single day. It is a relentless focus on teachers interacting with students every single day. It's less about curriculum and it's about teachers being clear about what they want kids to know, having highly engaged classrooms, and they know their kids and they're checking their understanding and giving them feedback every single moment, every single day. Large gains don't jump overnight. It's incremental growth relentlessly. That would be my take on that. And part of that research that I appreciated is when we set goals that are highly focused and we stick to them and we improve our practices on the administration side about coaching principals to coach teachers, to provide feedback, to help people grow, both the adults and the kids, working through PLCs, knowing students' data and addressing that each step of the way. That's what the research says improves student outcomes. And I appreciate the focus of our PLCs, our curriculum adoption, the reorganization in terms of trying to improve our coaching for principals so they can build capacity to coach their teachers each and every day. That is really important. As goals shift and the pendulum swings, it tends to take focus and resources away from what's most important, classroom instruction. And so that's my 2 cents and my little podium.
I'll say that's appreciated. My immediate idea is we shouldn't be repairing the PA systems. We should be turning them off. and other things that interfere with the classroom. I guess I'd like to ask the superintendent if you can reflect on what you think is possible. And if you're able to say what you think can be changed. I admit, I struggle with the fact that we're not adding resources much. Or if we do, it's in narrow areas, but. And then focusing on this goal about 8th grade math, we still have that responsibility to every student. But if you could talk about what you see as realistic goal and what we can do to get there.
Yeah, great question, President Holland. So I think we're focused on the right areas when we think about our math, our reading, and our life readiness goals. Then I think the second piece will be thinking about the statistics, because I think one of the easiest pitfalls to fall into would be it's not exciting that we're aiming for 60% proficiency, let's say. We should be aiming for 80 or 90. I love that aspirational message, but it also may not be statistically possible even. So I wanted to make sure that our goals are grounded in statistics and not even just the realities of our financial situation, but really just the mathematics. So I think the framework that Mr. Opitz laid out is reasonable, but also ambitious. I think a 2 to 4 point annual growth, even in a well-resourced system, is a feat, because at the end of the day, it's about the teacher in the classroom. It's about the supported and coached principals, and it's about the leadership team that's really aligned to these things and not all the other stuff. So that's why I have this fantastic group of leaders right behind me, because I want them to be speaking the same language that school board members are talking about, because these are the 3 things that matter. And if there are these 10 other things that they're focused on in their day-to-day, that's the wrong thing. It needs to be this stuff. So all of that to say, I do think that there is something to be said about, I don't know what number slide it was, but the slide that showed the 2 versus 3 versus 4%. I do think it's possible, but as a board, we have to figure out how we'll allocate our resources appropriately. They're very few, right? But when we think about the levers that we're going to consider, whether it be a PTR increase or what have you, we can do our best to keep our goals in mind. And usually what that means is focusing on our K through 3 PTR and allocations. We do have some levers in our pocket to try to hold our younger students as harmless as possible. So even given our dire financial situation, I think these are definitely the numbers that we want to think about as being ambitious, reasonable, and statistically possible.
Member Jacobs.
Thank you. Mr. Opitz, could you, I'm trying to make sure I'm wrapping my head around the above typical percentage.
Sure.
Could you recap what that means? Because I understand that there's a bell curve that 40% students are generally above. And then I'm also trying to intersect that with, in theory, all school districts are about to adopt a goal which ensures they're going to grow. And so what does that measure?
Sure. So really, so if you think about 40% being the typical, right? So imagine you were 100% above typical. That means you would be 80%, right? Because it's twice the 40, right? So for example, in the 3% metric, it's 9.5% above 40, but that's 10 divided by 40. So it's almost 25% above what is typical statistically. That makes sense?
Yeah. Could I follow up, Mr. President?
Yes.
It's a different question, and maybe for Dr. Bryant. I do track that trends indicate you're not going to jump 10% in a single year. Regardless of being a well-resourced system. And I don't imagine we spend a lot of time going down this road for a variety of reasons, but if we did adopt the funding model that was outlined in the most recent Picus-Oden report, where we essentially roughly doubled our BSA, what do you see as being the outcome? Do you see that any of this still range of outcomes would be appropriate, or would we be able to expand this in any way? Like, would we then have a 5% line on this chart, would you expect, or more?
Yeah, it's funny. I haven't had a lot of time to think about what it would be like to have that $90,000 BSA. But that'd be amazing. I mean, because really the Picus-Oden is about class sizes of 12 to 15 students in our lowest grade level.
And instructional coaches that are available.
Instructional coaches, well-resourced, district offices with leadership coaches and that sort of thing. So I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about, wow, if we got to that, $18,000 number, what would it mean? But yeah, I mean, I guess if we could get there, we should aim for the stars and go for 5 or 6, but I honestly haven't put a lot of thought into that.
And I guess the reason why I bring it up is it's not that I think it's realistic. But there's conclusive data that says that that funding model would be best for Alaska students. And it exhaustively outlines it. And if we're going to have a asterisk as a board and as a district to say, with adequate funding, we could potentially shoot higher, closer to a star. It seems to me that linking it to something that's well-resourced and was performed by an outside entity, not just, Pat Higgins thinks we should increase funding by 10% so kids can read. To me, that makes sense. Thanks.
So like that.
To tag in on that real quickly, it's interesting to contemplate if that happened, the lag there would be before we saw changes in test scores. I mean, one, just in the gearing up and making it happen. And teachers would have to retool because teaching 15 kids is fundamentally different than 25. I mean, you actually change what you do in the course of the day because suddenly you can do things that you just couldn't imagine before. There would be quite a lag before I think we saw the scores begin to change meaningfully. And I think it would be really powerful. But it makes me wonder what kind of lag we see when we're asking for an increase. And for the most part, we're giving people nothing. We're just, a refocus, which I don't know, to some degree as a board, I feel like we should have a goal of trying to figure out what we can take off people's plates so they can focus on the core thing in front of them, but that is separate. And I'll try to keep track of the speaking order, but member Weston, your hand is up high.
It's high. Oh, that's what we're gonna go for now. Reach for the stars. I'm just wondering, I mean, these are even annual targets. I'm not talking about reading right now, but we know, for example, there is this, thing, an implementation debt, right? Like different, I feel like there's a rate of change that is not steady. It's not linear when you adopt a new reading curriculum. I wonder, given our potential similar situation in the spring of 2024 as it was in the 2023, but we don't have the data. We're still waiting to hear what the governor will do regarding next year's funding, and we have a PPR +1 hanging in the balance for grades 4 through 12. We know that we're staring down the FY26 gauntlet. But maybe you aim for a lower annual increase for a portion of those years. And you say, I believe that change is possible at some point in time, and you have a more accelerated growth for FY27 and FY28. I mean, so your anticipated annual target reflects the reality of our situation, but also expresses aspiration at some point when the state figures out how to fund education. I don't know, maybe you develop that, maybe we develop that in a model.
Well, I think one of the points to keep in mind is these annual targets are really a mind frame.
Okay.
Because what our goal is to determine the 2028.
Okay.
And so there could be variation along the way. But the reason I wanted to show this to you is just so that you had sort of a realistic mind frame to help you make your decision.
And I think we can revisit the targets. I mean, the board can revisit the cut scores, the targets anytime it wants to. And so if we get more money, or who knows what might happen, but or less, we can always make that adjustment.
I'm interested in the teachers of primary, we totally agree, and the studies show that the principal has the biggest impact, all that, so I've seen those studies as well. But the two external factors, one is the disruption of modifying the schools, making larger elementary schools, so they're not going to the same school, that change, moving them from school to school could have an impact. And then 2027 is interesting because that's going to be the first year with the 6th graders are all in middle school compared to, because it'd be, 2025 will be 6th grade in middle school, 26, 27 now in 8th grade. in that, and we go and wondering how that impact has on it. The studies show academics go down. I mean, and that doesn't mean it will happen here. It just, look at national. And I'm just wondering how those goals, before we say, oh, the teachers failed, or the teachers did this or did that, I don't want to put anything on that when there's a lot of external factors in here. And how do we assess what the impact is or where that impact comes from? It's a difficult question, I know, that may be more rhetorical, you can ignore the question,
Well, no,
editorial, drop it at that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be hard to predict that. But going back to what I said before, and even just, you even mentioned it, Member Higgins, is like the classroom. That's like the magic spot. And so regardless if they're in middle school or elementary, that teacher and that administrator in that school, in that classroom, that's where the magic happens, whether it's a large school or a smaller school. And so I know that our focus right here is really building the capacity of those school administrators to coach those teachers. It doesn't answer your question. I'm sorry, I don't have that
That's
sort of
okay, I
magic
didn't
ball.
expect it.
But some of those factors, there will always be variables that we're having to sort of struggle with, to your point. And so going back to some of those key principles about maintaining focus on high leverage practices, which are teachers in the classroom working with kids and all of those pieces. I mean, that's what the research says incrementally will move the dial over time. And I don't know if you have.
You know, one of the things that, what we're seeing this year, this spring, we've sent out more congratulations to teachers because of the movement their kids have had in math. And we've gone out and actually looked at what are those high performing classrooms are doing. And that's why everybody's here today. We want to hear what you all have to say. And our goals, as we've worked with this group, we've worked all week, just resetting them thoughts about how we're going to support those principals and getting help for the teachers to do the work in the classroom, because we've seen some great growth this year. Great growth. We haven't seen that in years. And I see it as, this is the first time I've been in this district 28 years now. First time I've been optimistic about something we're doing to actually make a difference in those classrooms. So I think we can talk a lot about what are we doing, how are we doing these things? But at the end of the day, when we look at the goals, and the cut scores or the targets that we're looking at, we want to break targets, right? But we got to have a target, and we can't. I mean, I don't know how long we've had Y percentage in the thing for anything over the years, and now we're finally starting to see that turn. And one of the things I ask people is, our teachers are doing the best they can with what they have, and they're making some amazing strides right now. And we have to celebrate those with those teachers and not hammer them down every time, right? I mean, they're the ones that are making the difference under some very extreme circumstances right now. So I don't know. I don't know if that doesn't answer anything, but that was my thoughts as we're going here.
Member Jacobs and then Member Bellamy.
So I'm circling back to, I think, something Kelly asked earlier, which is, I don't know that I have the expertise to decide that 2, 3, 4, if we're picking a lane is the best, given, I mean, my sense is, just from a broad perspective, that I would prefer, and I think that based on the fact that the reading is our primary goal, that we attempt to allocate resources in a way that makes higher growth with reading proficiency a priority, and then math might have to, as a result of the resources that we're given and the priority that we're making towards reading, be a bit more reserved. And so that's really the only star I have to guide on as to what we would look at if we're going to use this table as kind of a rough estimation of where the goal should be placed. Does administration have a recommendation or other data points that we should be considering as to where to set the bar?
So it is luckily it's a school board decision. I'm just playing, but just from my background, statistics and math, they don't lie. And so, when you're looking at a national norm study, moving the dial a few percentage points is a big deal. When you're looking at a large data set, again, this is macro, and I just want to keep that in mind. You're going to have higher performing schools, you're going to have higher performing kids, you're going to have higher performing classrooms. But when you wrap all of the variables in, like, for example, what Member Higgins was talking about, demographics, poverty, all of those attributing factors, it tends to line out back to a normed curve as the population grows. And when you start moving away from that with a large population, it becomes more challenging. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't shoot higher than what is typical, because all of these are higher than typical. But when you're talking about a large data set, it becomes more challenging, and it's just a fact. And so something to think about.
Member Bellamy?
I actually had the same question as Member Jacobs on where the administration's recommendation. And I know that you're hesitant because it is our decision. I mean, like I said, I'm caught between reality and being aspirational. So I would be probably looking at, if I was to recommend a target, it would probably be at the 3%, but I'm not opposed to the 2%.
Member Wilson?
All right, so I'm gonna throw some spaghetti on the wall. I think our reality is not good. Given our resource reality, despite some of the amazing work that's happening, but I'm not, I don't think it's inevitable that we're going to continue that trajectory. But what I do think is realistic, and Dora, I really liked your word here that you would like us to be able to exceed goals. I think that we should plug in 1% growth for, add 1% to 23 for 24, 1% to 20, so we're doing +1 from 34.5 to 35.5, from 35.5 to 36.5, from 36.5 to 37.5 in 2026. And then in 2027 and 2028, say, yeah, let's focus on a 2% growth. That's far enough into the future that our fiscal reality, our resource reality could change. And if I did my math right, that puts us at about a 41.5% figure for 2028, which is 1.5% above the national level. And if I did my math there, that would still be about 3.75% above typical growth, which seems moderate, but encouraging and realistic for a 5-year goal.
So if I followed you, essentially starting at 34.5, you're looking at 7%.
It'd be 7% between now and 2028, and it would be slower and then faster. 3% of that growth would you'd be at 37.5% by 2026, 39.5% in 2027, and 41.5% in 2028. Does that make sense?
Well, can I ask a clarifying question as like a point of information,
Yeah.
Mr. Lesson? So I track the overall, and I guess I'm personally more focused on where we end up at 28.
Yeah.
I think that's the board goal.
Sure.
And the interim where we end up in 24, 25, 26 is interim. And if we can be more ambitious one year and can reset that, maybe something happens in Juneau 2 years from now. And so I'm tracking that, 41.5 at 28. I don't think that's unreasonable, but to be clear, I don't have a great lens that I bring to the conversation as to why. I mean, I don't know if we should be looking at how other similarly resourced districts are, where they're aiming. If I don't have ground to lay that as a reasonable expectation on, even though I agree that we should be more cautious, at least in regards to math. So how'd you get to 41.5?
I think that, well, in part because I think 2% from what I think I'm hearing from Chris's tea leaves. I'm not sure we hit 2% for AK Star for 2024. Okay, and I see him shaking his head. All
I
right,
don't anticipate.
so I think that beginning our path with an aspirational thing that hasn't happened is a bad trajectory. 1% is like, maybe we could be close to that. For next year, our resources are flat in our best case scenario to prevent class size increases. So I'd feel comfortable shooting for another 1% growth. Again, knowing we've got a lot of other things happening in our schools. I mean, the slide above, you know, emphasized that we have opportunity costs of every goal, initiative, and task. We have sixth graders moving to middle school. I mean, just, there's a lot of stuff going on. 1% growth this year seems like that's realistic. And there are going to be pockets of excellence where some, you know, some classrooms are gonna see extraordinary growth, others may struggle some more. But as a system, I'll take 1% growth for in a time of scarcity. And I think, again, I'm not feeling super great right now about our FY26 budget process. And I think setting a 1% growth for the 2026 school year is a message that we can send saying, hey, this is not adequate. We'll set a Picus Auden level aspirational growth when you channel our inner Jerry Maguire and show us the money. Like to make that growth happen. And so that's why I feel more comfortable for 27 and 28 doing like a 2% rate of growth each of those years. Because at some point, something is gonna change.
I appreciate that's helpful, and I saw the guard drop from just a second. And so, my preference is that, you know, not that we're not being open to mass communication, but if we can all be equals around the table and just use your expertise, tell us if you don't think that that's possible. For me, that's helpful, especially in retreat format. So thanks.
So I mean, I think that moving from 34.5% to 41.5%, that still gets us ahead of the national curve. Over 8 years, I mean, over 5 years, excuse me, by 2028.
Member Higgins?
I'm confused about the discussion right now. Are we projecting forth what we think we're gonna get? Or if we say we want 3% every year, is it going to change what the administration does? Or are we just measuring what the superintendent's gonna do anyway? I go back to that 2009 discussion on graduation rates. They wanted 1% because they knew they could make it. And we said, no, 3. And we said, what are you gonna do different? They said, we're gonna do the same thing anyway. I said, but then make it 3. If this is altering or impacting the resources, dedication, or some other activity, then I don't know what that is. If it's just a matter of projecting for maybe how much we get from the state, how much we hope to get, and we're not doing anything to achieve it, I don't know what we're accomplishing right now other than, you know, a projection. Is this administration going to do something different if we go with 1% and differently than if we went with 3%? Or is it gonna be treated the same way and we're just measuring outcomes?
So I'll chime in that regardless if the board chooses 1% or 6%, we're going to work extremely hard to make sure that we do whatever it takes to move the needle. I think from my perspective, when we set the goal, let's say that we set a 5% target for reading and a 1% target for math, that's going to help me remind the board how we should allocate resources. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're moving the needle for our students. So I don't want a board member to not favor 2% because they think the administration is going to work 4% less hard. That's not true at all. It's really about how we're going to allocate moving forward our resources and dollars. So I think in some ways the target is really helpful for a board member, but for the people here who are doing the work, we're going to be working hard next year, no matter what that number is.
And I would add to that, I mean, I think we want to have high expectations, but in the research, attainable. The reason attainable is, in all of the research, is that as organizations are working towards goals, when something's attainable, even if it's high expectations, and you have the opportunity to meet that, it does impact motivation and ownership throughout an organization. And so we want our staff to not just be typical, we like to be better than just typical, but we also want it to be attainable. So high expectations and attainable in the research is, it says it's important from a sort of an organizational culture perspective. And so just food for thought.
Other discussion?
Like, thoughts on 41.5? Like it's from administration, is that, are we shooting too low?
I don't think it's too low. I'm trying to grapple with the reality that even if we set a goal for 1% growth, our teachers are going to be working far harder with even less if we have to increase PTR. So I think that if they're able to accomplish that growth or even more, I mean, that speaks volumes to how dedicated they are. But you know, let's say that the governor vetoes all of our money. Our teachers will be working with less, and we're going to expect them to do more, even if it is 1%. So I think that what member Lessons outlined is reasonable. The only thing I don't know for certain is the above typical growth that her proposal means. Is that slightly less than 11%? I'm not sure.
I think that, I mean, I think it's about 3 point,
By 40.
yeah, it's 3.75%.
So it is above tip.
It's still above.
Slightly.
Which would be celebrated.
And I think the other thing that I'm just processing is that we still have our interim goals on our growth for our students who are not
We do.
proficient.
Absolutely.
So I mean, there are other metrics
Yes.
that are really pushing that needle forward. Proficiency is one bar. Remember, proficiency goes back to the bell curve that Mr. Opitz shared, where it's based off of norm reference versus criterion. But there's still a lot of work to be done to make sure that all of our students get to where they need to be to actually be able to read. Proficiency is a more nuanced term. A lot of people in the public think if your student's proficient, if your student's not proficient, they can't read, and that's not true.
And just to back that up, like, as an example, a student could be at the 55th percentile in math. And again, it's not a one-to-one, because they could be proficient, they might not be proficient, right? It's not exact, it's a statistical model. But that means you're in the top 45% of students in the nation, but you would not be considered proficient on the AK Star. So it's just two different purposes to Dr. Bryant's point.
And I'm going to ask the previous president, we
No,
don't actually
don't.
vote to adopt the goal today. So we're trying to come to a consensus
Consensus on the
on the goal,
not on the goal. We have the goal, the targets,
the target
For the goal.
the target.
that we would vote on at our next business meeting.
Right, we would vote, yes, we would, because the vote, it would have to come back for it to vote on.
So that's our goal.
And I knew the 3% would be a little high, but we just needed to kind of move on. Even though I think we can adjust that target anytime we really want to, I would agree with member Lessons. 1%, and then or whatever those adjustments.
It's 1, 1, 1,
One,
2, and
two.
2. That gets you to 7% between 2023 and 2028.
And I guess my only other question is, well, I think, Dr. Bryant already answered my question, I think, because he doesn't have a problem with that. Given our climate.
Yeah, I don't. I think the biggest challenge will be for board members when you get questions from the community as to how did we come to this 1%? What does this mean? Does this mean that our teachers are, doing a good job in my student's classroom and those types of things?
Mhm.
But in terms of moving the work and allocating our resources towards movement, I think we will do that based off of what was out there. But it's more of a community perspective. We don't understand what proficiency means or what a bell curve norm reference that test means. That's the
Mhm.
hardest part, I think.
And I have to admit, I think modest goals are easily explained by the fact that we're looking at modest resources. That right now, our tools for changing that goals are constrained and possibly going to be increasingly constrained over the next several years. It's not a happy message, but it's a realistic one. I guess my question is, do we want to set a number today and actually vote on it? And then be
Certainly.
ready to vote that number in August when we reconvene.
That was the goal of the,
Yeah.
that was the outcome we expected, so.
So I would look to the body for a formal motion per se.
I move to adopt the target of 41.5% for the goal of 2028 for our 8th grade math goal.
I'll second.
It's moved and seconded. Further discussion. And as I say, this won't be our official vote today.
Right.
But this will be what gets presented to the board to vote on at our next meeting.
I do think it's realistic, and I think, given we spent money we didn't have to get this year's budget balanced. We are probably gonna have to be creative in the future. But we also need to get this piece pretty much done.
Mr. President, I don't know if it's a point of order. I just want to make sure, what I think I understand about our retreats is we specifically previously in a retreat had a actual business meeting. In part from what I think I can recall, because that's where we were supposed to pass and adopt motions.
Mhm.
What I think I remember is that during a retreat, we typically don't have motions. It's more of
Right.
an agreement consensus without a formal record of a motion, because we
Mhm.
didn't actually call ourselves forward in a business meeting, so.
Ah.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah,
proceed
we
with
don't need
caution there with open
Just to make
meetings. Act.
clear, I'm using the form as a way so that we're all clear on what we're agreeing with.
Okay,
But it would not count as something actually passed by the
Okay.
school board.
Yeah.
Until we vote again in a meeting.
In August.
understood, thank you.
Other discussion, and I'll say unless someone voices an objection, I'll take that as a consensus. Second,
It doesn't matter to me, the goal.
Okay.
It's not altering what we're gonna do, so I view it as, I'm looking to try to get public support for what we're trying to do. Not trying to attack teachers, so whatever we do with this goal is less meaningful if we get to the issues of where we put resources and what we have expectations, so I think this is more. We do wanna give something to the community, we don't wanna attack teachers, and we wanna celebrate some success, so this is fine.
And I do think Dr. Bryant's points are well taken. How we talk about how we got to the goal, to the targets. I mean, some could look at this and say, we're giving up on our kids. We're not giving up on our kids. We're not giving up on our staff. It's the resources that, the future resources that got us like in a bind.
I can talk all day about classroom sizes, not filling teachers, for underfunding from the state. I won't have a problem from my standpoint, explaining to the public why we're limited, and I think the public is totally understanding and supportive of that dilemma.
And just to end, I think one of the important messages is what we would expect based on the design of the assessment is that 40% of students would be expected in a typical situation to be proficient. I think that's just an important message. And we can definitely help with that
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
because it is a tricky message. There's no doubt.
It is.
The points are
And
well
so we
taken.
are asking ASD to exceed that threshold.
We are. True. And hopefully if we hit it, we'll continue to exceed it further.
And we will celebrate every year that every moment that they do exceed those milestones. Absolutely.
seeing no other hands, we're ready to move to our 8th grade math goal discussion.
You want to take a 5-minute?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
so third grade is next, and do you want to take a break? It's identical process.
A good coffee cup, but,
Okay.
all right, that would be fine.
Two coffee cup.
right, we will take a 5-minute break.
That's cool.
Thanks. Absolutely. Sounds good. I appreciate it. That's been all hard. Yeah. Appreciate it, guys.
Names. You give me that. I told you that's the shit that we didn't need to be. Because you got-
First of all,
I'm gonna get.
yeah.
Well, that's okay.
Well, I wish you could say we joke on it. Well, just saying.
It'll still come back to us. Yeah. Yeah, it'll work. How you be, sir?
It was a good conversation. I feel like in my faith that we should try to be more optimistic on reading because of how we're putting another goal. Or aggressive. Like, we really just have to reach ourselves.
Right.
We need to make reading.
Right. And I think but you know, we gotta keep in mind, too, that the things that the superintendent has already done. He's restructured his whole, the whole, cabinet to be, to provide more coaching.
Which I hope would make it more, slightly more aggressive
Yeah.
if possible.
Yeah, yeah. And,
I just want to.
Let's wipe the slate clean and just like, our goal should be that. But then that lets them assess the narrative.
But I was like, we get 110% of our funding.
that's it. Who's got a, yeah. Need a chart.
Oh.
Hey, Dora. Got your chart? Mhm. Oh, thank you, Dora. First fast.
I mean, I don't know, I don't know. Anybody was- Yeah, so I mean, if you want to team up and do. Town that's been through it. And if we managed to work that. I want to say, like, maybe north and the west. What's the word where they're contiguous? That's the word I'm looking for, not congruent.
I would have gone with either.
I think it's north and west. It's like downtown and then like something like that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking the zip code like that's sitting in. Take a photo.
That's the owl.
That's good. I feel a little shocked by that thing, honestly.
I don't know. Talking with me. Yeah, my wife did retreat. Oh.
Yeah, no, I remember.
Not the bottom share, like something.
That's
good. Yeah, well.
It's like, I mean, that's crazy.
That's it, look where I.
I'm not, I'm gonna do it. I'm going. I decided I'm not gonna get my blood pressure up today. I took my pills, so.
The model.
My granddaughter's gonna be stopped by something. Yeah.
You just get back out to her. Did I forget to get her?
You didn't have to give nothing.
I didn't have to. No, really, this would have been like.
I don't remember. I don't remember. I don't know. I don't remember. I know.
She's a year old now, right?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I got it. It's probably in my, it's somewhere in my. Yeah, right, but I did. It's just a gift card, but I still wanted her to have it.
Well, she's doing just fine. She gets spoiled from grandma, literally. every
Yeah,
day.
right. That's all right, but that's not for Nana mine.
Right.
Yeah.
And I had her little brown baby.
Oh. She loved it. Her favorite thing is baby dog. And I get literally everywhere when I play with her. Brings me a dog, she has a dog, and I have to put the dog. Every time I put the dog on, she comes over. I've got video, no, it's not going. That's never leaving my phone. But every time I put the dog down.
They make us do.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I did my first 2 cards. Great.
Oh.
I remember.
Oh, that's so nice. I'm glad you get to enjoy that. Because there's really nothing else like it.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah. I did video, but he's never gonna leave. Yeah. Great for a while. Yeah. It won't be one thing. Andy, I just want to flag that we're massively behind schedule. I just want to make sure you're tracking it. I think the reading
It's 3 hours.
wasn't math was supposed to take 30 minutes.
Yeah, 30-minute introduction, 1 hour.
Oh, good, I'm sorry, I stopped
We
reading.
finished
good.
at- we are-
I increased our goal by.
Very good, great.
Increased our goal by.
Right, exactly right.
Yeah.
Never
We-
mind,
We've met our metric.
I was
Yeah.
We're gonna have you out of here by 7 o'clock.
we'll be able to watch sunset together, you know?
Oh, 7.
Why don't we sunset a week before
Was
goal this year,
4,
not
but we-
be a goal, Carl?
It was 4, but we increased it by 10%.
Yeah, right. No, thank you.
I feel like even saying so should be disallowed until we have more sunshine.
Yeah, there's no reason to really watch the sun go sideways. at this
Celebration
point
down on the park.
Other than it's kind
It's
of.
a Father's Day weekend.
It is.
Oh, Margot.
I was talking about you.
We were trying, well, it was, we were trying to not have it overlap with,
You can do anything. in this
with, the assembly meeting.
planet. Everybody is,
And
Marcus is going to the cabin for Father's Day. without me.
oh, it,
It's
like, oh, you guys go through,
The prompt is, I don't know if you saw his Facebook, because I read it and I was like, huh?
I saw you. We have a few members that like to break the 5-minute target. Break time.
Where's your sergeant at arms?
Two board members short.
Oh. You were too short when you started the day, so.
Second.
Said you were too short when you started the day, so. I'm just-
two shorts and one inch.
You have great board, by the way, yeah. Yeah, article about oil.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
When we get to that, so now we're talking about reading that, but I am about,
They're gonna go to.
because we talked, and we're looking at.
I say we don't.
The Bible, about the intersection.
So we'll go ahead and begin our, third grade English language arts discussion.
100%. There's some really great ones.
Yeah, 100%.
I think we're ready to begin.
All right, so Member Holman, here's the go ahead. So this is I appreciated the robust conversation. This is gonna feel very familiar. So the thread that we're gonna walk through is very similar. And so this may be a bit expedited in my hopes. So we're gonna look at third grade, setting the goal for third grade reading, and that's based on AK star. And so you can see here, we have the X from 2023, and our goal is to get to the Y of 2028. So again, I'm going to show you the linking study for MAP to third grade reading. I'm not going to go over this. I feel like you've got a strong grasp of this one. So one thing I want to mention is it just happens that third grade reading is also the 60th percentile on the linking study. I want to reiterate that fourth grade reading or math could be very well different, right? And so it just happens coincidentally that it is a similar percentile at the 60th percentile, but it is different based on different grades and different content areas. So you can see again here, in third grade reading, when you hit the 60th percentile, that's when you have that 50% opportunity or likelihood, I should say, probability of being proficient on AK star. So it's going to feel very similar. So we're going to take a look at AK star. This is 2023 third grade reading. You'll notice that our proficiency rate is at 32.4% proficient and advanced. And you can see the other grade levels there. And then here are the subgroups. So again, to just kind of frame our minds around this, subgroups are always a priority to us. However, in this, what we're working on today is that global perspective of all third graders for the entire population. That's what we're setting the goal for, which of course incorporates all of those. So you have to move all of them in order to achieve the overall goal.
Chris,
Yep.
we had math, sort of what the other big districts are?
It'll be in here.
Oh, it's here.
Yeah.
Okay, just not here.
Yep.
Great.
Oh, go back. So sorry, remember that one. Is there a subgroup for economically disadvantaged? We do have that. We didn't put it in this particular slide. This was from the vendor site. In our other conversations, when we dig into the details, we absolutely will have that. I don't have that for this overall goal setting. Okay, so here's what we were asking for, member lessons. We're gonna look at the 5 big districts, the proficiency rates and third grade reading. I'll take a second there for you to digest that. So just to kind of frame your mind again, remember what would be typical for third grade reading is also 40%, right? Above that 60th percentile, those top 40% are the probable kids that would be proficient. And I think it's important to note, you can see again, it's clustered. There is a little more variation on this one, but the variation is actually lower. Right, but there is not a single district. I don't know if there's a district statewide, but none of the big five are at 40 or above just yet.
What about some of the districts in the southeast that may be more adequately funded through the district cost factor?
We would have to look at it. It's all available to all of us on the DEED website. That's
Yeah.
where this comes from. Okay.
Mr. President, can I ask a question on the chart really quick? I'm just curious, did administration glean anything from the comparison of the big five districts? Or, math compared to reading? Did that tell you anything?
I mean, in a nutshell, we all have a lot of work to do,
Mhm.
for sure. I wouldn't shy away from that. As a state, we are not overall performing up to what is typical as an entire state. And so, in terms of between the districts, it's hard to say without, being closely having detailed conversations with those folks. I don't know if there's anything else. So not a ton of insight.
One of the things I recall is that some grades just seem to have kids in them that just are out of sync with the other grades. I
Yeah.
mean, with some years, and do we track that at all in some way or something?
So, to kind of, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but part of that realignment of the cut scores was exactly what you were talking about. So you notice that 60th percentile for both third grade reading and eighth grade math are very similar. Now that percentile across most grade levels, I think outside of ninth grade math, are in that sort of 53 to 60th percentile range. Prior to those cut scores in the linking study, some grades had to be at the 85th percentile to be proficient. It was way out of whack. Some had to be at the 50th, some had to be at the 70th. And so part of the realignment that the state pursued was closing those massive gaps, because to your point, it was like a roller coaster. And it really did not provide a coherent sort of assessment system overall with AK star, MAP, M class, right? And so there was high variability. And so part of the rationale for going back to the drawing board and looking at those cut scores was to add a level of coherence, because imagine a parent getting a report that says, yeah, hey, your kid is well below. And they go to another grade level where the metric is so wildly different, then all of a sudden they're proficient or advanced. It didn't make a lot of sense. So that was sort of the part of the rationale of the study that they did and the realignment of the cut scores. So next. So I'm not going to go over this. This is the same article, right? Best practices. And so we're all ready to this example of a 2%, a 3%, and a 4% annual target. Remember, our mission is to set the 2028 goal. Yep.
Okay, same question that I asked at this stage in the math slide. What's your spidey sense about? I mean, we know that this year's kindergartners made extraordinary growth. This year's first graders made a lot of growth. I think the rate of growth, I think it's harder in second and third grade. It's the first year of the K-3 curriculum. I anticipate that that teachers will become more fluent and comfortable and activated is not the right word, but that's what's coming to mind. Adept at using the curriculum and in PLC practices. Well, what is your sense on the likelihood of a 1%, 2%, 3%, 4% change that we would see between 23 and 24, not having seen our 24 data yet?
I don't anticipate large changes.
Okay.
I would have to go back to the data to look at the specifics. But a couple of things that you mentioned there that I just want to make sure we're clear on it as a group. when we're looking at those K1 metrics that you referenced, those are on foundational reading skills.
Right.
They're discrepant skills. They're things like letter sounds, blending, decoding. AK Star is a comprehension type of assessment that's looking at grade level standards. And so over the next few years, as we implement and see our results, we might be able to sort of decipher some correlations. At this time, we can't yet because it's so new.
But just sort of to put in reference, this year's kindergartners, so in the,
Right.
sort of in our imaginary 2024 data for kindergartners are going to be third graders in 2027.
Right.
And so I guess I anticipate their growth. I think the growth of that particular cohort may be more accelerated than kids who will be third graders in 26 or 25.
So I can't predict that.
Yeah.
However, I understand your logic and the research is really clear. K1 is when you catch up with kids.
Right.
As they get past first grade, it becomes exponentially harder to catch kids up. It's just, the research is super clear about that. And if we can catch kids up in kindergarten and first grade, the thought or the logic is that they will be able to access more rigorous instruction second and third grade, which hopefully then bridges what to that proficiency rate that you were talking about. Can we predict that for sure? Of course not. However, that logic does make some sense. for
So,
sure.
so I'm gonna go ahead and throw more spaghetti on the wall because I can have the honor of having the seat at the table.
Oh, go ahead.
So I would suggest, given your sense, Chris, that maybe we are not seeing a whole lot of growth in third graders from last year to this year, but we anticipate more of that growth going on, that if we were to, rather than have a flat 2, 3, or 4%, I think that we could target a 14% total growth by 2028, broken down into plus 1% for 2024, plus 2% for 2025, plus 3% for 2026, plus 4% for 2027, and plus 4% for 2028. So that is it's a rate of change that I anticipate seeing increase over time. So I got to 14%, so that would get us, what would that give us to 46.4%, which is just a hair less than 3%. And again, if I did my math right, it'd be 16% above typical growth, which would be like cause for fireworks and celebrations, right? I mean, but I think ASD has historically been capable of moving students. And again, this creates space to allow what the Alaska Reads Act, the protected resources that we have tried to protect, kind of, for early education, to really ramp up and manifest over the next few years as teachers increase their skills and develop more competencies when it comes to that relentless focus and providing feedback and the principal coaching, right? So this doesn't say we're gonna have a steady state of growth at 3% yet, but we're gonna get to a 4% state of growth by the last couple of years of this growth, last couple of years of this target. So I think that's kind of exciting.
Member Donald?
Yeah, the average growth on. Not this slide, but the slide that was the Alaska State Assessment showing the different districts. Between 6 and 7%, but Matsu. Showing growth of over 11%. What are they doing differently than everybody else?
Can you restate that so that I can follow you? Okay.
What is Matsu?
Where is it?
So what I would caution, Member Donnelly, is that between 22 and 23, that's when the cut scores changed. And so it's going to be really hard to decipher because there was a realignment of the cut scores between those 2 years. And so, yes, they showed that higher growth. But you'll notice that they're also 7% below what is typical, right? The 40th percentile. And then when you factor in that there was a major cut score realignment, it makes that question really tricky.
Right, and moving the cut scores increased the number of students who were considered proficient for third grade. And that whole process is why the AK Star data was delayed so much, because it had to work through the research folks and then ultimately the Board of Education.
It's just that they're the only outlier here by more than 50%.
It's a good question, and it's something worth asking a few more questions about. I appreciate that.
Member Jacobs?
Yeah, thank you. Sure. I appreciate the spaghetti. I appreciate that it's a more ambitious goal than our math goal. So I think that's gonna lead to resource allocation, to Dr. Bryant's previous comments. Just really quickly on Member Donnelly's comments regarding Matt Sue's growth. I think you, on record, when the cut scores changed, and when we transitioned to the AK Star, specifically encouraged school districts not to be careful and wise with victory laps. That you were referencing us, but I think we should apply that logic just generally. But I do think it's appropriate to ask questions. So I just want to make sure we're flagging that, circling back to those, that school of thought. With that said, I guess my underlying question for Dr. Bryan is, how would this spaghetti affect resource allocation? And then specifically with resource allocation, there was a great article, Mr. Opitz had a quote in, which referenced Alaska Native students in particular, but I think there's a broader conversation regarding our students with cultural differences and how that interacts with the standardized tests that are being administered. And so will that, in regard with an eye towards resource allocation and just the assessment in general, is there something that we can do to ensure that there is equity and opportunity where we're not seeing students negatively impacted because of who they are?
That's a good question, Member Jacobs. So because the proposal, the spaghetti is a rather ambitious, it's a larger or more slightly, I don't want to use the term ambitious, but it's a higher target than what we're talking about for math. In my mind, when we think about resource allocation, when we develop a budget for the school board, that's what it's going to keep in mind. So for example, if there were an upcoming adoption for ELA curriculum, that probably wouldn't be something that we'd ask you to table. We'd probably favor something else to cut. That'll impact the way that we think about our PTR reduction proposals moving forward. Thinking about the levers for underserved populations, just given the research on how culturally relevant curriculum can make a big difference for our special subpopulations. That's something that our academics needs to be thinking about to make growth. So I do think that there's a lot of value to the way that this goal is being structured. And what you'll probably see is more resources being held harmless in the realm of reading for lower grade levels. And then the things that we'll consider for reductions and cuts will probably impact other areas.
Could you speak to the cultural piece too specifically? Like, do we see? What is our assessment as to, is it accurately capturing what students who aren't white are known or able to do?
So I think it's a really valid question, and one of the things that we've been working hard, especially over this past year, and you know, I'm relatively new in my position, is when we look at our, for example, school board reports and our assessment results and the disparities and the subgroups, our Title VI folks are in the room, our ELL folks are invited, our special education kids are invited. So we're making a much more intentional effort to investigate that and ask hard questions. I think the other piece that's really critical is you've heard a lot about the PBIS implementation and this idea of having culturally responsive, safe, predictable environments based on strong relationships, I think could have a significant impact because it is the daily interactions and the way that kids and families feel when they walk up to our schools and they walk into our schools, and whether they see themselves in that school and how connected they are, because it does impact motivation and whether we want to come to school. And so I'm encouraged by a number of the initiatives that we're taking on that could potentially address those. And I just want to emphasize that we're taking an intentional approach to that.
Member Higgins?
You made reference to Matt Sue with the realignment of test scores and the impact. Wouldn't that have impacted Anchorage and the other districts equally? And so we don't see the same reflection or not? I'm just kind of curious because that doesn't quite gel. And then, and then could that have impacted test results now?
So, yeah, so what I was referencing is that change in cut scores makes it difficult to sort of quantify or capture what's different. Because, for example, Anchorage increased 7 or 8% and Matsu increased 11%, I think. And so to Member Donnelly's point, I think it's worth a question. But it's a tricky question because of that such a structural change in the way the assessment was. That's what I meant by that.
For what?
I think we also have to keep in mind how correlated measurements of proficiency are with socioeconomic status. And what I recall from an ICER paper that came out about this time last summer is that Anchorage has, significantly more economically disadvantaged students than the Matsu. So I think when you look at proficiency, it makes sense to me, not as an excuse, but as an encapsulation of reality that we have more, when they lowered the cut score, more of their students might have been closer to proficiency and captured in the new level than Anchorage's population, which were something like 53% economically disadvantaged. And actually, it looks like when you look at our families, we have more economically disadvantaged students clustered at younger grades than older grades. This is something that I realized at some point recently, which makes sense, right? Because as a parent, you might be a younger parent if you've got, kindergartners in the system, then if you have a senior in the system, maybe you've got other kiddos at home, your family is just still establishing itself. So I think that we may have a same, the district might have a percentage of families who are economically disadvantaged, but I think they're clustered more in our younger grades. So I think that the challenges that those families have may be more pronounced, which is a really long answer for a thought bubble.
And it might be true.
It might even be true.
Member Higgins?
I recall meeting with Finley and they said we'll never catch up with the results because of the economic issues. And how they do things differently, and that caused their results to go up. But I'm looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, we're comparing 40 percentile, that's for all school districts. But there's a difference in results between large school districts and smaller ones, according to the data I saw. And there are other factors involved with that. Is there a way of weighing that in and looking at what is an appropriate comparison that will recognize that or not? And I do know that some school districts have been successful addressing this issue. What would happen if we put a focus on all kids academically advancing a full year and then looked at these test results as a measure of the impact without that being the goal?
Trying to capture all of that in my mind.
I want to, you've got questions A, B, C through Z, okay? You can do whatever you want to do with it.
I think your point to the 40% being larger populations is accurate, right? And that would bear out. So for example, if you look at particular schools with particular demographics down to the classroom level, you're going to see much higher variability. That 40% is really important to keep in mind. That's macro. And because we're a big district and we have lots of kids in the population, that's why it's a relatively reliable way to look at it for us. If it was a school district of a few schools, that would be a much more problematic way to interpret that data. So to your point, I appreciate that. And there's a level of accuracy to that for sure. What was another aspect I could?
If we were looking, right now, we're looking at the target, how are we doing at this grade reading? But if we had a target focused on all students advancing a full year plus academically, then it would be reflective how well we're being effective, and it wouldn't be the goal, it would be a measurement, it would just be an assessment of how well that's impacting us. I remember in Philadelphia, the goal was reading in the first second, you're absolutely right, the early grades are critical. And one of the studies showed that 90% of the effectiveness of low classroom sizes is achieved by having low classroom sizes in K through 3. Okay, and their goal was reading, everybody's reading, and in this district, Southside Philadelphia, part of it. And they were successful. They were they was a massive size of Anchorage, but it was a large district. And they were successful that way. Putting that focus on academically advancing in that grade, and then it carried throughout the whole thing. I'm just trying to figure out goals and how we measure this and whether we're measuring the right thing.
Well, what I would say is, I believe that your goal of looking at the overall proficiency rate as well as the interims does capture that year's growth. It's not, it might not be spelled out specifically to a particular point, but the fact is you're not going to move that goal unless a vast majority of kids are growing at a year's rate. It won't happen. And hence the interim goal, focusing on the catch up of those other kids, is when you look at the overall goal and the catch up goal, it really does capture growth for the overall population, because you will not meet this goal unless your kids are growing. And if a kiddo, for example, is at the 70th percentile and proficient, if they grow in that 40 to 60 range, they're making a year's growth. That's an average range in a statistical model, right? However, if a kiddo is below proficient and they grow a year's worth, it's like this. They stay equally far behind. And that's why it's so important to not only have the major goal that captures the overall growth, but the catch-up growth for those kids that are underperforming. It's not dialed out the way that you're speaking of, but it does capture that metric.
I don't have the slides from that recent goal monitoring session, but that's why it was really encouraging to see that students in SPED populations and economically disadvantaged students were making some of the biggest
Right.
catch-up growth. I mean, that is where you're going to see the needle moving here, is that we have so many students who fall into those critical and the English language learner categories, that if you can move the needle there on catch-up growth, that's what's going to transform that.
And to Member Higgins' point, if you're seeing that incremental, that means that everybody's growing. Otherwise, you're losing ground. If you get catch-up growth, but other kids are decreasing, that it captures that idea of all students growing.
Other questions? Other spaghetti people wish to throw at the wall? Right now, we have one glob of spaghetti. I think the question before you is, do you want to accept that as what we would put to the board in a public meeting? And someone have an alternative?
Give it again.
Yeah, so
One.
the short version is that it would get us to 46.4% in 2028. And that is a 14% change from 32.4% to 46.4%. But it would really be, +1 from 23 to 24, +2 from 24 to 25, +3 from 25 to 26, +4 between 26 and 27, and +4 in between 27 and 28. And so there is it would be looking at an accelerated growth as the district's resources and competencies, as the resources allow and the competencies build, with that really being a lodestar, right? We're going to struggle to make any other goal in this district if our students can't read their math problems, and they're going to be disengaged by the time they get to high school if they can't read and they struggle with math. And we're going to struggle with graduation rates. So that's why this should be a more aggressive goal, because the return on investment is highest when we pour our resources into our youngest learners.
And this is an area that has targeted funding.
And there's additional, there, you
Yeah.
know, there's a little bit of additional
Little bit, right.
funding that we could actually see in our FY 25 budget and talk about in August, you know, in a couple more months, after the governor signs the, you know, it's a couple $1 million that we not, that's a one-time fund, but we should be deploying that in service of this goal
Mhm.
in some way, shape, or form.
Instead of hand up, member Dahl?
Oh, no.
No, okay. Member Jacobs and then member Higgs.
Yeah, so if member Lessons has, informally quasi moved, said spaghetti, I would second, I would just reiterate that while I understand the narrative, and I think it's important to communicate to the community as needed, or homework as to how we got there, I would still prefer to note that the interim goals provide some flexibility as to the, whether it be 1, 2, 3.
Mhm.
But the end target of in 2028, I think makes sense. And if we're going to make one thing the main thing and be overly ambitious, this has got to be it. So, yeah.
And again, a 2028 goal of 46.4% would be 16% above typical growth nationwide, which would again be cause for fireworks and celebration.
Member Higgins?
I like this approach for a couple of reasons. One, it recognizes that the impact of trying to change this, is some of the preschool stuff that's being done, and changes that are done now, in K 1, 2, it's gonna be impacted later, and you're not gonna see the results immediately. You can't, in that 1 year. So I like the approach of acceleration. We know we got some positive impact with the preschool, but we're not gonna see the benefit of that till more like 2028 anyway. So I like that goal of accelerating it. Makes sense to me.
Superintendent Brian, do you want to weigh in on whether you think it's reasonable, attainable?
Based on what I'm hearing, it sounds reasonable, but I want to let our assessment folks just fact check.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think, it's a higher goal than what's typical. I think that's important, I appreciate your perspective about the comm side, communicating, how we came to be here. And I think, it's definitely worthwhile, and I think we can do it.
Without any further comment, this will be what we bring to the board in August for adoption. That moves us to our reading goal. Well, I would say that moves us to our what?
Does that mean that everybody else will enjoy the nice day?
Say that one more time.
And everybody else except us will enjoy the nice day?
Oh, I have them working all day.
Oh, okay.
Oh, me, God.
I should, that's your prerogative.
Thank you for the really thoughtful conversation.
Thank you,
It's
guys.
really engaging and appreciated.
Only 3 years in the making.
Yeah, we're done early.
We are running amazingly ahead of schedule.
We still have
Check
housekeeping
to see,
things, right?
We could, I think, can we figure out the community council assignments?
Yeah, we have those housekeeping chores that.
Yeah, we've got